The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight on The Agenda.
I think to suggest that Huawei was clearly more of a threat than TikTok really signals a failure of imagination when it comes to how destructive social media can be.
Then, later on The Agenda.
HMCS Ajiba has been shrouded in local controversy. The nearly 2,000-kilometer trek cost $6 million.
Also tonight.
Things that are incongruous activate our dopamine system, and it sets our mind in motion trying to figure out what's going to happen or why something is incongruous.
Last month, the U.S. Congress passed a bill that could force the Chinese owner of TikTok, a short-form video app, to sell its assets or face a ban. Our federal government is also currently undertaking a national security review of the app. So, what should be done with TikTok? Is it a looming national security threat or a harmless app filled with fun videos? And should Canada ban it? Let's consider that with, in Oliver, British Columbia, Taylor Owen, Director of the Centre for Media, Technology and Democracy at McGill University and co-host of the TVO podcast Screen Time. In Brooklyn, New York, Jamil Jaffer, Executive Director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. And here in our studio, Janice Stein, the Bellsberg Professor of Conflict Management in the Department of Political Science, Founding Director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. And Connor Healy is here, Director of Government Research at the Security Technology Research Group, IPVM. And it's good to have you two here in our studio. You have been absent from here for far too long, so it's great to see you again, Professor Stein. And to Jamil and Taylor and Points Beyond, thanks for joining us. Before we get to the discussion about a possible ban, let's just first, I think, better understand the risks as you see them related to TikTok. So, Jamil, get us started. How would you characterize the security threat that you believe, or don't, TikTok represents?
Well, I think that TikTok does represent a security threat in a particular sense. I think all social media platforms do. Social media platforms collect a huge amount of information about their users, and that's certainly true of TikTok. TikTok maybe raises additional concerns because of its connection to the Chinese government, or its possible connection to the Chinese government. I think the real question is not whether TikTok presents a threat, but rather what the best way is of addressing it. Which we shall do. Taylor, how would you answer the question?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of depends how we define a risk and a national security threat. I mean, there's certainly a capacity on these platforms to shape discourse and influence discourse, as we've seen in elections, previous elections on other platforms. There's clear potential abuses of data, as Jamil mentioned. There's a whole host of broader sort of public health issues that we could bring into our national security conversation, although I would sort of warn not to. But there's also economic interest here. And the U.S. government, which bill or legislation we're talking about, has a long history of incorporating economic power and interests into their national security threat assessments, which is clearly happening here too.
Janice, do you see a genuine national security threat to Canada here?
I agree with Taylor. Of course, there's a security threat anytime you agglomerate and collect data in the way that all social media platforms do. The fact that it's owned by China, and there is no separation, adds an extra dimension. But on the spectrum of national security threats from China, this is at the very low end of the spectrum. And that's, I think, the bigger story. There are many more serious ones.
Connor.
I think those who study China understand that the distinction between a corporation and the government's interests is a legal fiction. In other words, it exists on paper, but not in fact. And what that means is that TikTok, its owner ByteDance, is controlled by a group of data kleptomaniacs. And they should not be within a mile of controlling such a platform. The worst thing that American social media companies, and they absolutely should be reined in, the worst thing they're going to do really is try to sell you something. With TikTok, the threats are far greater.
Let's follow up on the data angle. We are told that a quarter of Canadians use TikTok. So Taylor, follow up on that. What sort of data can be mined given that reality?
Well, it's the same kind of data that can be mined by any large social platform that acts as an intermediary between our devices, mostly our phone, and our commercial and daily social activity on the internet. So it's the things we purchase, where we go, our faces in terms of facial recognition technologies that are embedded in these tools, our political beliefs, our political engagement and activity. I mean, it is a lot about us, which is why many people have been arguing for clamping down on some of those data collection capacities from a broad range of platforms. The question here is, I think what Connor mentioned, like, is there something different about this company collecting these data? I think that's at the core of some of these issues.
All right, Connor, play it out. What concerns do you have about how that data, whatever, could be used?
Well, that data could be used to understand what individual Canadians think and also what the Canadian population thinks. I mean, I think China has made it quite clear, due to a number of incidents that they want to basically bulldoze our democracy. And TikTok could be a very useful tool for that. It's not just about data access, by the way. It's also just about access to users. Unlike data brokers, who, sure, they could sell the Chinese government data, you're scrolling on TikTok hours a day. You're not doing that with data brokers. And they can test things out. They can algorithmically target people. That's a significant risk for a government like China that is an autocracy. Autocracies, shouldn't be running major information platforms.
Jamil, play that out for us. Targeting people, what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Connor has made a really important point, but in a parenthetical. The kind of data that TikTok collects is data that you can get easily from data brokers. Anybody who wants this kind of data about Americans can buy it from data aggregators and data brokers who have essentially no restrictions on what they can take from social media companies and what they can share, including with foreign governments. And that, I think, is a real concern here, is that this even if you think, as I do, that TikTok's collection of this kind of data is a real problem, a real threat, you have to ask, is this ban going to be effective? And I don't think it is going to be effective, because the same kind of information that TikTok collects is so easily available from data brokers. And security experts across the United States have said that, including the former general counsel of the National Security Agency, who said it in an op-ed in the New York Times late last year. So this is really not a contested point. Everybody recognizes that this kind of data is easily available from data brokers, and that this ban is not going to make a real dent in the Chinese government's ability to surveil Americans or Canadians or anyone else.
Janice, we're all operating here, or at least all of you are operating on the 100% certainty that the Chinese government has access to everything that TikTok picks up on. Is that a given?
I think we make that worst case assumption, Steve, and then still come to the conclusion that the data that ByteDance collects, they can get many, many other ways. And that's what made me put it relatively low down the spectrum. Connor's point that they can try things out, well, frankly, if I were looking for threats to democracy, I would be just as concerned about what's on X, destabilizing democracy, and some of our other social media platforms. And any government in the world can, in fact, and we saw this with Facebook, access American social media platforms and try things out. So I'm still waiting to hear concrete reason why a ban would be effective.
Are you suggesting, Connor, that TikTok is more nefarious than X or Facebook simply because of the Chinese ownership, or is there more to it than that?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the standard that's already established in Canada under the Investment Canada Act is that foreign ownership by a company like China, if it's likely to be abused, that is sufficient for the Minister of Industry to bring a forced divestiture to the cabinet. He doesn't need evidence that it has been abused. Just like we wouldn't need evidence that China would abuse ownership of this TV station if it happened to have it, or would mismanage Ontario's nuclear power plants. I mean, that's the level of power that we're talking about when it comes to TikTok. And I think a fundamental disconnect here, by the way, I completely agree that we need to rein in the behavior of social media companies like X and Facebook. We should absolutely do that. But we can rein in that behavior. How do you intend to deliver a subpoena to ByteDance in Beijing, and what do you think they're going to do with it? You cannot enforce privacy legislation on ByteDance. That would be like trying to teach a fish to climb a tree.
Okay, Jamil, you want to comment on that? Not the fish climbing the tree part, but the rest of what Connor had to say.
So I guess I disagree with Connor on this point. I think that there are ways of enforcing privacy regulation. You can, for example, have data localization mandates that require companies like TikTok to store the data they're collecting about a particular set of people in that country. And this is something that U.S. regulators have been, exploring already. And TikTok claims to be storing American data now in the United States. I don't know if that's true, but it's something that can be verified and something that can be enforced. I guess the other thing I would just say on this point is that, there is a free speech concern on the other side. It's not just that this ban would be ineffective. It's also that the ban would be a restriction on the ability of Canadians or Americans to access foreign media. And that, that kind of practice, restricting citizens from accessing foreign media, is something that, for very good reason, has been associated in the past with repressive regimes like the Chinese Communist Party or Iran or Saudi Arabia. Those are the kinds of countries that restrict their citizens from accessing foreign media. And I'm not saying that there are no circumstances in which a democracy should restrict its citizens from accessing foreign media, but we should be pretty wary, I think, about going down that road. And we shouldn't do it when there are other ways of addressing the problem.
That's an angle I was going to get to later, but since we're here, you want to weigh in on that as well? Is this an infringement on free speech?
There's no question. There's no question it's an infringement on free speech. And there has to be a higher standard of security risk when there's an infringement on free speech. It's not that we never do it. Of course, there are circumstances in which we did it. So let me give you an example where I think there's a much stronger case to take action, which was Huawei, as distinct from TikTok. The reason there's a much stronger case on Huawei is the government, part of the government's digital infrastructure, what the government called the core, was being built by Huawei. Well, it makes no sense to allow core digital infrastructure to be built by a company that is run out of China.
But this isn't that.
That's what I'm saying. This is, in fact, an entirely different proposition with TikTok, where you can get the data anyway. The argument of experimentation is just not persuasive. And I think, on balance, then, Jamal's argument about free speech really matters.
Connor, no concerns about an infringement on free speech here?
I mean, I agreed with the restrictions on Huawei. I think to suggest that Huawei was clearly more of a threat than TikTok really signals a failure of imagination when it comes to how destructive social media can be when directed to divide citizens or deliver messages that are undermining our democracy. I do see the free speech argument. I'm concerned about that. I think this should be, as narrowly tailored as possible. But basically, my sense is that sort of no matter what road you go down here, you end up with a forced divestiture, whether that's privacy legislation, whether that's trying to take a more narrowly tailored approach. I mean, take the algorithm, for instance. Sure, you could have TikTok store data in the US or store data in Canada, but ByteDance is ultimately going to control the algorithm, and it ultimately is going to control TikTok. And we won't be able to enforce any of these rules. And then we'll end up in a place where the only option left is divestiture, and all we've done is we've wasted years and quite a lot of legal fees to end up at the same result.
Taylor, free speech concerns for you?
Of course, there are to some degree. This is the platform in which people express themselves, and we consume that expression. And look, we have one of the world's top First Amendment and free expression legal scholars on the call, so I'm not going to wade into that discussion fully. But to Janice's point about the bar here, I mean, obviously, we are okay already with the bar of banning TikTok on government devices, and my university has also banned me from having TikTok on my university phone. Now, why is that, right? Well, it's clearly there's some perception of IP risk or infringement of of sort of data that we have in the university system, and certainly the government thinks there's some risk. So they're willing to limit the free expression and free ability to free consume from their workers. So the bar is clearly the important measure here.
Yeah.
But I'd be asking a couple broader questions. I mean, one is, what makes TikTok different than broadcast media, other broadcast media, which we've certainly regulated in the past in terms of what we allow into our domestic airwaves? In many ways, TikTok is more like broadcast media than what we traditionally think of as social media, in the sense that when we open a TikTok feed, we're seeing a highly filtered stream of content, where a very small number of pieces of content every day get seen and consumed in almost a broadcast way by people who are watching TikTok, not participating in it. And I think that's a really key differential here when we're thinking of whether we regulate this as a social platform or as a broadcast media. The last thing I'd say here is that, I think we need to ask why this is the first piece of federal legislation regarding digital platforms in the US that we've seen in the last 20 years of social platforms. And it just happens to be the one that is also being heavily lobbied for by the US tech industry.
Yeah.
And has this element of protectionist and jingoism in it that makes me pretty uncomfortable, I have to say, for many of the reasons Jamil mentions too.
Janice wants in on
I'm
that.
very glad Taylor made that point, because we alluded briefly to the economic arguments. There are really powerful economic forces here that are pushing this legislation in the U.S. Congress. And it's actually too bad that Canada just follows in its wake this way. I mean, Meta, Facebook's lunch is being eaten by TikTok. Just look at the graphs. Instagram, it is about to overtake these. These companies have gone all out. They are very powerful monopolist players, and they have launched a lobbying campaign that's absolutely unprecedented, Steve. So to classify this wholly as a national security issue, it's just not correct. And that's why really understanding the bar, being really careful about articulating the risk, even hypothetically, what is the risk? And getting some evidence that risk is grounded is fundamentally important.
Let me get Jamil on that, though. I mean, to the best that I can tell, whenever anybody from Facebook or Meta or X comes before Congress, the representatives or the senators can't stand them. They really put them through their paces. So why would they be doing the bidding of those groups by helping to ban TikTok?
It is true that some of the leaders of these social media companies have been interrogated pretty aggressively by Congress. It is also true that Congress has not passed any regulation whatsoever to constrain the activities of social media platforms. So, there's a kind of rhetorical position, and then there's a substantive position, and those are two completely different things. But I wanted to address, maybe this is going to be a slightly more controversial point, but address the concern that TikTok is spreading Chinese propaganda or might spread Chinese propaganda in the future. I mean, I have no way of evaluating that, concern. I agree that, it's conceivable that that the Chinese government might use TikTok in that way at some point, even if it's not doing it now. But let's assume for a second that, imagine that the Chinese government says tomorrow that from now on, TikTok is just going to be Chinese propaganda 24 hours a day. Let's just assume there's no question that all TikTok is Chinese propaganda. There's still, I think, a really important free speech principle here. Citizens of an open society, of a democracy, have the right to access propaganda if they want to. This came up at the U.S. Supreme Court 50 years ago, I guess 60 years ago now, in a case called Lamont versus Postmaster General. I won't give you the whole, the whole story, but the short story is there was a law that required people to register before receiving communist propaganda from abroad. They were allowed to receive it by mail, but they had to register with the post office in order to do it. And the Supreme Court here in the U.S. struck that law down on the grounds that it was an unjustifiable interference with the right of American citizens to access ideas from abroad. And I think that's exactly the right decision. As Taylor knows, I'm not enthusiastic about everything that the U.S. Supreme Court does on free speech. I'm not a kind of sort of blind champion of the First Amendment, but I think this is a really important principle that the U.S. Supreme Court recognized in that case 60 years ago. And I think that would apply here too. If, even if you assume that TikTok is Chinese propaganda and only Chinese propaganda, Americans should have the right to receive that propaganda. And if the government wants to tell them it's propaganda or wants to restrict what TikTok can collect, that's one thing. But if it wants to restrict them from accessing foreign media, that I think is quite another. And for reasons we've already discussed, I think we shouldn't go down that road unless there are very, very good reasons for it. And I don't think there are here.
Connor, I want you to weigh in on this, but before you do, I want to read this from The Guardian. This was an article entitled, "TikTok is part of China's cognitive warfare campaign." So I'll read this excerpt, then I'll get you to comment. Sheldon, let's bring this up, and I'll read along for those listening on podcast. Translated Chinese military reports suggest that warfare is shifting from destroying bodies to paralyzing and controlling the opponent's mind. We ignore this broader context at our peril. Platforms like TikTok exemplify cognitive influence by shaping the beliefs and preferences of its vast user base while collecting data and developing psychogenic profiles of its users. TikTok's algorithm has the power to mold public opinion and exploit user data to shape preferences, biases, and beliefs. Okay, fire away.
I think there is, an element of scaremongering and kind of esoteric language involved in that article. But there is an underlying point, which is that we're in a sort of new age of influencing people through digital platforms. I think that if you're concerned about lobbying in favor of a TikTok divestment or a TikTok ban, you should be equally concerned about the fact that within 24 hours of this bill in the US being introduced, TikTok conducted what was probably the largest, certainly the largest in terms of reach, lobbying campaign in US history within 24 hours, reaching the phones of millions of people and giving them a button to call their congressman. And they did that, with just a few clicks.
Did it work?
Well, it sort of backfired on them, actually. It wasn't a very good strategy, but it backfired because it made the point that TikTok is a risk, that it can so easily deliver information to people and actually try to influence U.S. legislation.
But isn't the information that it delivered entirely accurate? I mean, TikTok told its users that Congress is going to ban this platform. You should tell them not to if you don't want them to. And then some of the users did that. Isn't that entirely legitimate?
I mean, I think we could probably get into a debate about whether it's a ban or divestment, but I don't want to get hung up on the information that was in the notice. The point is the capability, not the information.
Yeah, but that's the only time they've done something like that, Connor. And again, I think the context really matters.
Because this was a lobbying effort.
That's right. There was legislation before Congress which was going to, quote unquote, ban or divest. It doesn't matter. They, as Jamal says, you put that on your app, and it was accurate. This is what Congress was about to do. And if you don't like it, click your button. It's just a quick comment that the Guardian piece on cognitive warfare. It's really important for viewers, Steve. Cognitive warfare, every time you read a sentence, you change your brain. Now, we could call that cognitive warfare, but that's not what we're actually talking about now. There's an argument about the Havana syndrome, right? If we're talking about biomedical or biophysical change in the brain, which is entirely different than the pernicious effects that some of us think social media has on people.
Vive la différence, you're saying.
Vive la différence. Again, that's somebody who's just aligning these two things together and not being careful in the discriminations that they're making.
You want to finish your point, Connor?
Sure, and I largely agree with that. I just want to level set. Context does matter, and the context is that the government that ultimately controls TikTok is the same one that, instead of engaging legitimately engaging in an extradition process, kidnapped 2 Canadians and held them hostage. It's the same one that set up police stations in Toronto instead of dealing with inconvenient things like, rule of law in this country. And the list goes on and on and on. I think that context matters. It is entirely predictable that TikTok would be abused when the opportunity is right for China. The fact that it hasn't happened yet is basically irrelevant.
Well, before the clock gets too far away from us here, Jamil, come on in here and let's talk about where the rubber's hitting the road. Already, the government of Canada, I know the government of Ontario, has told all of its public servants, some of whom work here at TVO, take TikTok off your phones. Yeah, you can't have it on your phone anymore.
I think that's smart. I agree with that policy. I think that governments have a totally different relationship to their employees than they do to their citizens. It's one thing to restrict a government employee from accessing TikTok on a government device during work hours, or something like that. And another thing to say that ordinary citizens can't access TikTok on their own devices. And I think that the bar for that second one should be much higher than the bar for the first one.
Yeah, coming back just for a moment, Steve, to Taylor's point that this is broadcast media. This same government, our government, allows satellite TV viewers in this country to watch Russian news channels. Why? Why? You could argue, by the way, that you can make stronger arguments, frankly, that they aren't manipulating Canadian public opinion. Once we go down this road, that's the real problem here. Once we go down this road, we have to set the bar very high in order to undertake this kind of activity.
Taylor, you want to make a distinction between whether it's acceptable to ban it off public servants' phones versus from everybody's phones?
I agree with Jamal. We should take it off government phones. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a clear distinction there. But it also highlights that there's also a clear vulnerability that we need to take seriously. And the question is where that line is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
it's possible that social media companies, platforms generally should be off limits for government employees.
So you'd add X and Facebook and Instagram to that list as well?
I don't think I'd complain about it.
Okay. Except whoever is filming President Biden's TikTok videos.
Very good.
It's really interesting as we're talking about this again, because I'm always looking for the evidence. There was a data breach of the U.S. federal government, as we all know, in which the data on personal data on 1.5 million people was hacked. Right? Now, you can argue there's far greater risk in that. You can see that. You can see how that's going to be used. You have to ask yourself, where is the government, the U.S. government, that it didn't secure the personal data of its employees much more carefully? So, again, when I'm ranking the risks, Steve, TikTok just ain't there.
No, I hear you. But so let me give Connor equal time here in saying, obviously, you're in agreement with everybody else in terms of off government-issued cell phones.
Absolutely.
But you want this legal product banned from everybody's cell phone in Canada?
I want it to be divested from. Many American businesses have been forced to divest from their subsidiaries in China. Beijing could choose to do the same. But I accept the fact that Beijing probably won't permit a divestiture.
No, it won't.
And because of that, it would ultimately be banned. I take the point. I think people should be able to access, Russian TV and watch that. To be clear, TikTok is not where people are getting their Russian news. It's where the statistics say that more than 40% of users are getting their news. The other free speech argument here is that Chinese ownership of such a central platform for so many people actually, I think, undermines the ability for speech to be legitimate to an extent. Take the recent example of an outpouring of support for Palestine on TikTok. There are a wide range of accusations in the US that was engineered by China in order to hurt US interests, that they promoted pro-Palestine posts. I have no idea if that's true. I don't think that it is true. But the point is,
but it's plausible.
And for every other outpouring of support for every issue, we will continue to have no idea to what extent it might have been manipulated, which is why we need trusted businesses to be in control of social media platforms. Other social media platforms can't really be trusted right now, too. But by virtue of the fact that they're based in the US, they can be reined in, and TikTok can't.
Jamil, let me get you on this. Do you think regulation can get us far enough down the road so that an outright ban is unnecessary?
I do. I think that privacy regulation would make a huge difference on a number of different fronts, not just by directly protecting citizens' data, but also by reducing the ability of these social media platforms to micro-target messages to small communities. The way that social media companies micro-target messages is by relying on all of that data that they collect about all of us. And if they don't have that data, they can't target messages in the same way. So it would have not just a privacy implication here, but a real implication for the health of public discourse more generally if we impose those kinds of privacy laws. The other thing I would, impose if I were in charge are transparency mandates that would make it easier for the public and researchers and regulators to understand the decisions that these platforms are making. Because right now, as Connor, I think, says entirely appropriately, these decisions are opaque to most of us. We don't know the decisions that the social media companies are making. We don't know how those companies are shaping and distorting public discourse.
Taylor, can I get you on that issue of regulation versus an outright ban?
Absolutely. I mean, as has happened time and time again, our failure to bring in broad, comprehensive data policy and digital regulations over the past 20 years leads us to a place where we contemplate far more draconian actions than are actually needed. So I would much rather begin with things like modernized data privacy law, of which the US has no federal law and Canada has an inadequate one, competition policy that makes the market more fair when we have these dominant global actors participating in our digital markets. And perhaps most importantly, to Jamil's point, online harms regulation that looks at some of the clear harms of these platforms broadly defined and puts in transparency mechanisms like the new Canadian Online Harms Act does, makes them do risk assessments on their products, gives us visibility into the algorithmic systems that are deciding who sees what and when, provides AI and bot identification tools, and does a whole host of things to support and the design choices and improve the design choices of products that are used by children, which is part of the debate about TikTok here, whether we like it or not. And so, look, I think there are all sorts of ways we can raise the bar for all platforms through smart policy. And then if there's still this sort of poignant threat, national security threat, we can talk about that in a more specified way.
Let me pull one more idea out of left field here with just a few minutes to go, and that is, I don't know how many of you saw the news recently, I think it just happened last week, that a bunch of school boards in the province of Ontario have decided to band together for the purposes of suing some of the big tech companies, now admittedly those based in North America as opposed to China, but using lawsuits maybe in the same way they used lawsuits 50 years ago against big tobacco in order to reduce the pernicious influence of tobacco. Do you think that is a potential avenue here, Janice?
Look, it's a harms issue, right? That lawsuit raises the issue of harms to young people, which are indisputable, frankly. And I think, why are we getting these lawsuits, Steve? Because the government has failed to regulate, and government has failed to impose standards. So when you, especially in Canada, not in the United States, but especially in Canada, when you take to litigation, when you resort to litigation, it's because government has failed. We need broad-scale regulation about the algorithms, about recommender functions, about to make these social media companies much more transparent. And it doesn't take a lot. It takes Canada, Britain, the United States, and a few other governments to really get serious in real time, because you can't do it only in one jurisdiction, and collaborate internationally. And this issue almost goes away.
Connor, is a lawsuit approach in your arena?
Well, it depends on what the lawsuit requires. I mean, a major problem with a company like TikTok, as I've seen in my job with dozens of Chinese companies, is that when you try to deliver a subpoena to Beijing for information on their algorithm, they'll sort of laugh you out of the room. They likely won't comply with that.
What's going to happen when they deliver the subpoena to Meta asking for its recommender algorithms?
Meta may try to get around it, but ultimately, a judge can force Meta to do things. And maybe they won't fully comply in the way that they should, but you cannot enforce those rules on a company based in China. I think this is a fundamental problem. And I think that ByteDance's leaders and China's leaders would probably be quite amused, actually, that we're making a debate about TikTok's problems, about the problems with ourselves. I support all of this privacy legislation. I think everything that has been mentioned should be implemented, but we've kind of lost the plot here.
In other words, at the end of the day, this is something we individually can solve if we want to.
Yes.
Yeah.
We choose not to. We're sucked in.
Yeah.
Whereas the problems that China presents are vastly greater. As I said earlier. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I only cut everybody off here because we're plumb out of time, and I got to save time for the rest of the program. But I do want to thank you all for coming on to TVO tonight. Jamil Jaffer in New York City, Taylor Owen in British Columbia, Janice Stein and Connor Healy here in our studios at Yonge and Eglinton. Great discussion, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
HMCS Ajiba, a Cold War-era submarine, has been attracting tourists to the shores of Lake Erie ever since it was decommissioned and converted to a museum in 2012. The sub has been a costly undertaking, and as I found out, it's sinking this small town financially.
Dive! Dive! Now we enter into the motor room.
Memories come flooding back for Jerry Brown every time he steps foot on HMCS Ajiba.
The electricians would call the heart of the submarine.
He served on the Cold War-era submarine between 1976 and 1978 as a storesman.
I was responsible for ordering all the supplies for the boat maintenance supplies, that is, and spare parts, stuff like that.
Now retired, Jerry guides tours for submarine enthusiasts. Being a submariner is not for everyone, particularly those who have a fear of tight spaces.
And here was the captain's cabin, very small. I'll sit in here. This is as if he was sitting at his and having his supper, or his office would be the same thing. This is his table, and he actually even had his own sink.
How tall was he?
We had one captain here that was 6'7". He used to get dressed out here for some reason.
From the bow to the stern, every inch of the submarine is fitted with gauges, knobs, and handles.
Now we're in the forward accommodation space, and here we had 15 bunks in this compartment, this section of the compartment, and bunks are 6 foot long, so anybody that was taller, you learned to sort of sleep in the fetal position.
HMCS Ajiba stretches 90 meters long and 5 stories high. At the bow of the sub, you have the torpedo room. And as you travel toward the stern of the ship, you pass through the accommodation quarters, the control room, also known as the brains of the operation, followed by the engine room and motor room. At full capacity, HMCS Ajiba could carry a crew of 67 submariners. HMCS Ajiba was one of 3 Oberon-class submarines operated by the Royal Canadian Navy during the Cold War.
HMCS Ajiba is an Oberon-class diesel-electric submarine. The Oberons were a British-built submarine, so everyone subsequently names their boats starting with the letter O, so we named them after 3 of the indigenous nations of the country. Okanagan, the Onondaga, and the Ojibwe, although since most people pronounce the vessel as Ojibwa, we say Ojibwe are the people. Ojibwa is the vessel.
The sub was considered technologically advanced for its time, and also one of the quietest, making it difficult to detect and excellent for covert operations collecting audio and visual intelligence in hostile waters.
We can disappear, for one thing. We're under the water, very hard to find. Being a diesel-electric submarine, they're very, very quiet, not like a nuclear that is pretty loud when it's underwater compared to us. And so our stealth capabilities were a lot more.
The particular build was designed for stealth, and they were very successful at it. They were considered the quietest boats of their era, and a lot of people, particularly from foreign navies, would say if an Oberon didn't want to get found, you could not find it.
The underwater warship went into service in 1965 and was decommissioned in 1998. And just over a decade later, the Ajiba was slated to become scrap metal. That's when the Elgin Military Museum came calling.
The Elgin Regiment, which is a significant part of the Elgin Military Museum, was an armored regiment during the Second World War, and we were looking for a gate guard vehicle, essentially a tank. When we called National Defense, we were informed that they didn't have any tanks, but how would we like 27 tanks? And when we inquired, because we didn't want a whole squadron of tanks, we were informed, well, ballast tanks, water tanks, fuel tanks. And one thing led to another, and here's a submarine.
The privately owned Elgin Military Museum, located in St. Thomas, Ontario, stepped up to save the submarine and gave it a second life as a tourist attraction. But the museum needed a special location to house the gigantic vessel. Port Burwell in the municipality of Bayham, situated on the north shore of Lake Erie and at the mouth of Big Otter Creek, was chosen as the final resting place.
We were restricted to Elgin County, which was either Port Stanley or Port Burwell. And so we came to Port Burwell, and I think it's been an asset to the community.
In 2012, the submarine was towed from the east coast of Canada through the St. Lawrence Seaway and Welland Canal before arriving in Port Burwell. While the submarine was donated, the nearly 2,000-kilometer trek cost $6 million. For over a decade, visitors from around the world have been visiting Port Burwell to see the wartime museum.
They have come from all over, and in fact, in the first year of operation, we had a call for a gentleman wanting to book a tour, and I asked him where he was calling from, and he said Moscow. And there was about 10 seconds of silence, and he said, yes, that Moscow. His son was doing a doctorate at Western University, and he heard about the submarine and was coming to see his son and wanted to see the submarine.
According to Ian, the attraction has been such a draw that they've overbooked tours last season. The museum has not one, but 2 maps for guests to mark the location they're visiting from.
We're actually on the second version of the map now because we couldn't fit any more pins into Europe. When we started the new map, on the old map, we had never had anyone from Iceland. The first day we started the new map, we had somebody who was there from Iceland.
It's also been a place to reminisce with former submariners.
And that's where the torpedoes go. Also used sometimes for beer storage. I am a member of the Submarine Association of Canada. That's one of how we ended up here, because we support the submarine. It's good to see, some of the guys you never sailed with, but you are a submariner. Once you're a submariner, you're always a submariner. Another term that some use is called SQUID, submarine qualified until I die.
There are many submariners a remarkable number who live in the area who do come down, and some of them obviously have quite an attachment to the boat. There's one in particular who will get up and go for a drive from Barrie and arrive here at the submarine. And there have been days where he's arrived and his phone is rung, and I've heard his wife say, "Oh, I bet you're at the submarine."
For all the excitement surrounding the submarine, HMCS Ajiba has been shrouded in local controversy. Remember that $6 million price tag to bring the vessel over? Well, the museum took out a loan to pay for it, and the municipality of Bayham secured the loan. In 2015, the museum ended up defaulting on the loan, leaving the city on the hook.
Like almost every municipality in Ontario, after COVID and this inflationary period and rising costs and limited or reduced transfers from upper tiers of government, we're all struggling to balance budgets and to keep property taxes in line and still try to meet the needs of quality of life issues for our community. So it's a challenge to do that. In addition, which is unique to our municipality, that we carry that legacy debt that is chewing up most of our discretionary budget.
Bayham Councillor Timothy Emerson estimates the city pays just over $300,000 annually, about 2/3 of its discretionary budget, towards the loan. The payments have brought into question the future of an important local landmark. Port Burwell's Lighthouse was constructed in 1840 and used to navigate commercial lumber ships. It's one of the oldest wooden lighthouses in Canada, but was closed down in 2023 because of structural issues.
There is some issues with the integrity of the building, and it is in a state of continuing decay and needs to be addressed in the near future. Or shipping, that was an important landmark, an important economic anchor for the area. And it's an important historical landmark, I think, because it signals the development in the industry right back to pioneer days when they used to cut red pine masts for the British Navy. This was the source of them, right? This town we're in right now was a sawmill. There was a mule train to Port Burwell. So, like, in my opinion, the Lighthouse anchors us to our past so we know where we're going in the future.
It will cost the cash-strapped municipality an estimated $1.5 million to repair, but Councillor Emerson is hoping to raise some of the money.
Elections coming up, and there may be rounds of grants or loans that are accessible for stuff, but we have to be shovel ready, so that means engineering. So last year, we took money that was in a dredging reserve, and we slid that into a Lighthouse reserve. That's approximately $65,000. We were told that it would take about a little bit more than $90,000 worth of engineering to make that shovel ready. So for me, the priority is, like, the first step to be able to grab any grants or funding that's available is to have that extra $36,000 so that we can get the engineering done.
There will be about $4 million left on the submarine loan when it comes up for renewal next year.
March of 2025, the loan is up for renewal for the submarine, and it won't be at 2.5% or whatever it is right now. It'll be double. In the last term and the term before for council, which I wasn't a part of, it's been priority to put enough in reserves to pay off that sub loan when it matures.
As a longtime resident, he admits he was never a fan of HMCS Ajiba coming to Port Burwell in the first place, but understands that decision is in the past.
At some point in the future, we have to put differences aside and see how we can work together to build it so that we drive industry and money towards our community. And someday we'll get past all of this, and it'll be a story we tell over a beer. Remember that crazy time, right? But at the moment, it's difficult. But I think if we put our heads down and try to come together as a fundraising entity and work together with all levels of government, we can overcome this, and then it will be a beacon for the municipality.
Have you ever thought about what's happening to your brain when you look at art? This next story has some answers.
My name is Dr. Jim Davies. I am a cognitive scientist from Carleton University, and here I am at the McMichael Canadian Art Collection. Artworks of various kinds pique our curiosity by showing us things that are somewhat incongruous, something that we don't quite expect. That might be an unusual kind of face in a painting. In music, it might be a change of key or rhythm. And in a story, it might be a plot twist. Things that are incongruous activate our dopamine system, and it sets our mind in motion trying to figure out what's going to happen or why something is incongruous. It's the same logic that makes us pay so much attention to stage magic shows. We see something impossible, and that's incongruous, and it makes us look hard and try to figure things out. A lot of artists do what they do because they're wrestling with some kind of problem, something in their life that they don't understand. It might be love, or it might be death. And as they wrestle with it, they create art to try to make sense of it, and maybe try to communicate the problem, or maybe what they see as the solution to the problem, to their audience. A lot of the appreciation of art is of two different kinds. One is sort of a pleasurable recognition of pattern that often comes across as beauty. And another is piquing our curiosity by showing us something unusual or incongruous. And many works of art take advantage of both things. In a piece of music, for example, it manipulates between familiar patterns and changes that regain our interest and pique our curiosity. So a good work of art will often involve a lot of familiarity and incongruity that balances between pleasure and drive, the opioids and the dopamine in our brain. We are looking at a painting by Daphne Ojig. It's called Rebirth of a Culture. This is a painting that really captured my curiosity. There are a lot of things going on, and it's sort of endlessly fascinating to look at. I'll talk about some of the things that are in it and the psychology behind why we find paintings interesting. If you look, you can see faces in here, lots and lots of faces, and that draws in our familiarity. And people tend to like paintings and things like that that have recognizable features in them, animals and faces. We have a whole part of our brain dedicated to looking at faces. So there's no surprise that many, many paintings feature human beings and human faces. But you'll also notice that the faces are not particularly realistic. This one has no mouth. This is two faces that are kind of combined in a strange way. And this draws in our curiosity. When we see things that are not quite what we're used to and not quite what we're expecting, our mind starts a process of trying to understand it and trying to figure out what's going on there. And a painting often doesn't offer a whole lot of answers, which means your mind can't let go of it, and you keep searching. And that kind of searching is the basis of the curiosity that drives you. There's also a lot of pattern going on in this painting. First of all, we have colors. So we have repeating colors here and over here. And when we see the same thing in many places, that familiarity brings some pleasure. So one of the key things about appreciating art is this balance between pleasure and drive. And the pleasure often comes out of recognizing things, seeing patterns. And the drive to understand more, often comes from things that are incongruous and a little bit strange. This little pattern here, right? We have similar kinds of patterns here, but then it's contrasted with very large areas that don't have a whole lot of detail, right? Why is that? This kind of thing makes our mind wonder. So this piece here is the kind of piece I think you could have a reproduction hanging on your wall and never get tired of looking at it, because there's so much mystery and incongruity that keeps you curious. Here we're looking at Shaman Disciples by Norval Morisot, also made in 1979. We can see three main human figures here, and they are recognizably human, but they do have some characteristics that are a little different. This is a characteristic mouth shape in many of this artist's paintings, and it kind of resembles a beak, and in some of the other works this is made more pronounced. Here we have another bird. Here we have a bird with a kind of a hooked beak that we can see, and here we have a few more. These pointed elements are a recurring theme. The fact that these people are kind of merged together makes us wonder what's happening here. Are they all part of the same being? Are they separate? Some of the colors are shared between a person and an animal. It makes the difference between humans and animals seem a little less severe, which draws us in, makes us wonder about that. We also have lots of patterns and repeated colors. These two works they feature some very bright coloration. It really stands out, very saturated colors, unlike a lot of paintings that use a more muted palette. And this is, the saturated colors are very attractive, particularly to young children, which is one of the reasons that babies' toys and cartoons and coloring books feature very saturated colors. It probably speaks to us at a very primal level. Here we have another painting. This is Forest Wilderness by a group of 7 artists, J.E.H. McDonald. And like many landscape paintings, it has some features that make us think that it's really beautiful. It turns out that human beings evolved to find a landscape beautiful if it was a good place to camp. So what do we have here? It's a view from high up. Here we can see that we're high looking out. We can see very far. And this allows us to see where water is, see where maybe animals are, maybe enemies that might be coming to harm us. So a view from high up is usually good. This is why we don't often have a lot of landscape paintings that are of wall faces or cliff faces, because the visibility is very poor. We also have a lot of lush wilderness. Wilderness and plant life is indicative of possibly fruit and other things to eat. So our ancestors who found these kind of views pleasurable tended to camp there and had more offspring. The artist also uses some tricks to make it look a little bit more three-dimensional, which are very interesting. So if you look high up in the distance, one of the reasons this looks like it's further away, even though it's a part of a two-dimensional painting, is that the colors are muted. It's called desaturated, and they're a little bit bluer. And in fact, if you go to a real landscape and look off in the distance, the mountains you see in the distance look bluer and a little foggier. This is because of atmospheric effects. On the moon, you wouldn't get that. But here on Earth, some of the colors on the redder side of the spectrum get pulled out the more atmosphere it goes through, and so you get that desaturation. The reds are actually down low near the front. These are things that are closer to us. So it's possible that the artist put more red to emphasize even more the difference between the red and the blue to add the perception of depth. This is a beautiful painting. This is all about curiosity, but as I said before, there's curiosity and then there's pattern detection and familiarity that causes pleasure. There's pleasure and drive. And this painting, I would say, is mostly pleasure. When you look at this painting, there's not a lot to wonder about. It's relatively straightforward. There aren't a lot of incongruities that your mind needs to figure out, but that's okay. It's a different way to make a painting compelling. It's just pure beauty with nothing to make you really wonder or curious, but it works anyway.
Tomorrow on the agenda.
Making sure that your business is sustainable has only increased in importance. And there is certainly a desire for some companies to show that they're doing something and a temptation to take a shortcut, which is what greenwashing is.
That's tomorrow on the agenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.